Welcome back to Game of Theories, where I introduce the theories of management, administration, and leadership. This is episode 27. In this episode, we're going to explore equity theory. It was first introduced by John Stacy Adams in his 1965 article, Inequity in Social Exchange. The equity theory has since been expanded upon and refined by various scholars in the field of social psychology. If you ever felt like you put a lot of effort into a relationship or project, but didn't get the outcome or reward you deserved, you're not alone. This feeling of unfairness is a common experience when the outcomes of a social exchange don't match up with the inputs. In the workplace, the inputs employees bring to the organization are merit, effort, skills, training, education, and experience. Job-related outcomes are salary, bonuses, promotions, benefits, and status that employees expect to receive in return for their inputs. When outcomes don't match up with perceived inputs, employees may feel like they're not getting what they deserve. The key point here is that perceptions of fairness are subjective and based on individual experiences. What one person perceives as fair might not be the same as another person. So, like beauty, fairness is in the eyes of the beholder. What does inequity mean in equity theory? In John Stacy Adams' 1965 article, Inequity in Social Exchange, Adams wrote, "Inequity exists for a person whenever he perceives that the ratio of his outcomes to inputs and the ratio of others' outcomes to others' inputs are unequal." Based on this definition of inequity, equity is achieved when individuals feel that they are receiving a fair and proportionate exchange for the contributions they make to a social exchange compared to others in similar situations. For example, if I feel that I am receiving a fair return on my inputs compared to Joe, it means that the ratio of my outcomes to inputs is perceived to be equal to the ratio of Joe's outcomes to inputs. This balance of inputs and outcomes creates a sense of equity and promotes positive outcomes in social relationships. Is equity the same as equality in the context of equity theory? The answer is no. Equality means treating everyone in the same way, regardless of their individual circumstances. However, equity in equity theory means that individuals receive outcomes, such as rewards or benefits, that are proportionate to their inputs, such as efforts, time, and resources, taking into account their unique characteristics and circumstances. For example, treating all employees equally might mean providing everyone with the same salary, benefits, and rewards, regardless of their individual contributions or needs. However, in an equitable system, employees receive outcomes that are proportionate to their inputs, taking into account their individual circumstances. This might mean that an employee who has been with the company for longer, has more experience, or has a higher level of skill may receive a higher salary or more opportunities for growth and development. Here is an example in education. Equal access to education might mean that all students are provided with the same resources and opportunities, regardless of their backgrounds or abilities. However, an equitable system would consider the unique circumstances of each student and provide them with the resources and supports they need to achieve the same level of success as their peers. This might mean providing additional resources or accommodations to students with disabilities or those from low-income families. Again, equity theory emphasizes the importance of balancing the inputs and outcomes of social exchange to achieve a sense of fairness rather than treating everyone equally. This means that individuals may receive different outcomes based on their inputs, as long as those outcomes are perceived as proportionate and fair. Here is an outcome input ratio equation that describes how people perceive the fairness of outcomes in social exchanges. The equation consists of four key terms and forms the basis for equity theory, which emphasizes the importance of balancing inputs and outcomes to achieve a sense of fairness. O means outcomes. I means inputs. P represents person, any individual for whom equity or inequity exists. A represents other, any individual with whom the person is in an exchange relationship or with whom the person compares himself with both he and other are in an exchange relationship with a third party, such as an employer, or with third parties who are considered by the person as being comparable, such as employers in a particular industry or geographic location. Let's consider a hypothetical example of two employees, Alice and Bob, who work in the same department and have similar job responsibilities. Alice has been working in the department for 5 years and consistently receives positive performance evaluations. She works hard, takes on additional tasks, and consistently goes above and beyond what is expected of her. As a result, she receives a higher salary and bonus compared to other employees in the department. Bob, on the other hand, has been with the department for only 2 years and receives average performance evaluations. He completes his tasks satisfactorily, but does not take on additional responsibilities or work beyond what is required of him. As a result, he receives a lower salary and bonus compared to Alice. Now, let's use the equation to determine if there is equity between Alice and Bob. If Alice receives a higher salary and bonus compared to Bob, but is also taking on additional tasks and working harder than Bob, then her outcomes may be perceived as proportionate to her inputs, while Bob's outcomes may be perceived as proportionate to his inputs. In this case, there may be equity between the two employees. However, if Alice is receiving a significantly higher salary and bonus compared to Bob, even though they have similar inputs and job responsibilities, then there may be inequity between the two employees. Bob may perceive that he is being unfairly treated, and this may affect his motivation and engagement in the workplace. To achieve equity in this situation, management may need to adjust Bob's salary and bonus to be more proportionate to his inputs or provide him with additional opportunities for professional development and growth. Here is a question for you. How can the outcome input ratio equation be used to evaluate the equity or inequity between the CEO or president's pay and the average employee pay in your organization? Please leave your calculation results in the comments section below. Using this outcome input ratio equation, the feeling of unfairness can come in three forms: equity, disadvantageous inequity, and advantageous inequity, which could be informally described as feeling underpaid or overpaid. Please pay attention to the A in the equation. As I mentioned earlier, A means others. It is the reference point we use for comparison to form our perception of equity or the lack thereof. Using a different reference point, we can have different perception of equity or inequity. For example, someone making $70,000 per year might feel satisfied with their salary when comparing it to someone making $20,000 annually, but might feel disgruntled when compared to someone making $200,000 a year. The idea of comparing outcomes and inputs is not unlike looking at the return on investment from a mutual fund. When we invest, we expect a certain amount of return for our input. A 5% return for mutual fund A may be seen as advantageous when compared to 2% return from mutual fund B, but disadvantageous when compared to a 10% return for mutual fund C. These comparisons of outcome input ratios form the basis for perceived inequity, whether in its advantageous, that is, being overpaid, or disadvantageous form, that is, being underpaid. So the next time you're comparing your salary or investment returns to someone else, remember that your perception of fairness is influenced by how you compare your inputs and outcomes to theirs. The perceived fairness is subjective. One way to achieve equity when feeling underpaid or overworked is by changing our perceptions of the situation. This is because fairness is subjective and influenced by our individual perspective. For example, instead of feeling angry about being underpaid, we can reframe our perception of our job by focusing on the enjoyment we get from it or the friendship we've made as a result. We can also see the work as less difficult than we originally thought, thereby reducing our perceived inputs. By perceiving our employer's outcomes and inputs differently, we can also make adjustments that help to create a more equitable situation. In extreme cases, we can even opt for a bailout strategy, such as quitting our job. A less extreme approach to cope with perceived inequity is quiet quitting. Quiet quitting is a phenomenon that occurs when employees who feel unfairly treated at work do not resign or actively seek to improve the situation, but instead reduce their level of engagement, motivation, and productivity in subtle ways. They may minimize communication with coworkers and managers, reduce effort on tasks, and do not take on new responsibilities. Quiet quitting is often a passive way for employees to express their dissatisfaction with the perceived lack of equity in the workplace without taking the more drastic step of leaving the job altogether. Inequity theory, reducing inequity is a multi-step process. It starts with a certain set of circumstances that cause us to feel an imbalance in the outcomes and inputs. From there, we are driven to take action, either by making tangible changes or by adjusting our perceptions of the equation's four key items. One important point is to keep in mind that our perception of inequity can shift over time even if the underlying factors remain the same. Let's say a company has a policy of promoting from within and offering higher salaries and benefits to employees who have been with the company for a longer period of time. A newly hired manager who has just joined the company may perceive this as unfair, as they are not eligible for the same benefits as their colleagues who have been with the company for longer. However, as the manager gains more experience and time with the company, they may come to see the value of the policy and perceive it as equitable. In this case, the underlying factors, the company's promotion and compensation policies have remained the same, but the manager's perception of the equity has shifted over time. By finding ways to rationalize the input-output relationship, we can achieve a sense of balance and harmony. It's a fascinating process that's reminiscent of dissonance theory. Dissonance theory explains how people deal with inconsistencies between their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. According to the dissonance theory, when people experience a mismatch between their attitudes and their behaviors, they feel an uncomfortable psychological tension or dissonance. To reduce this dissonance, people may change their attitudes or behaviors to bring them into alignment with one another. People may rationalize or justify their behavior or attitudes in order to resolve the discomfort caused by the inconsistency. In both equity theory and dissonance theory, our minds are hard at work to justify and make sense of our experiences. No theory is perfect. What are criticisms of equity theory? One major criticism of equity theory is that it has limited predictive power. Because the theory is so abstract and can be applied to almost any situation, it's difficult to make specific predictions about how people will react to perceived inequities. For example, employees who feel underpaid might respond in different ways, such as working harder to prove their worth, resenting their employer and reducing their effort, or distorting their perception of the work to feel more satisfied with their pay. Another criticism of equity theory is that it neglects the role of procedural justice in shaping perceptions of equity. Procedural justice refers to the fairness of the decision making process used to allocate rewards and resources. Even if the outcomes are perceived as equitable, if the process used to arrive at those outcomes is seen as unfair, it can still lead to dissatisfaction and low motivation. For example, employees may feel that the process used to determine pay raises is biased and not based on merit, leading to feelings of inequity. The third criticism of equity theory is disadvantageous inequity. That is, when an individual perceived that they are receiving less than others for the same input, receive little attention in early research. Most of the research focuses on advantageous inequity. That is, when an individual perceives that they are receiving more than others for the same input. This lack of attention to disadvantageous inequity limits the applicability of the theory to situations where this type of inequity is prevalent. To address this criticism, one interesting study was conducted by Carl Weick, who investigated how people perceived equity in their pay by manipulating the pay of a group of participants working on the same task. Participants were divided into three groups: an underpaid group, a paid equitably group, and an overpaid group. The results showed that the participants in the underpaid group perceived their situation as inequitable and responded to it by distorting their perceptions of the task to enhance its attractiveness. Their response was called task enhancement. This result is a direct parallel to dissonance studies in which people work on boring tasks but convince themselves that the experience was interesting, exciting, and enjoyable. Another study tested the idea that the antecedents and consequences of dissonance reduction would have implications for equity theory predictions. Dissonance reduction refers to the psychological process of reducing cognitive dissonance, which is the mental discomfort or inconsistency experienced when a person holds two or more contradictory beliefs or values, or when their beliefs or values are inconsistent with their behavior. In this study, participants were randomly assigned to one of four conditions: choice and underpayment, no choice and underpayment, no choice and overpayment, and choice and overpayment. The results suggested that choice and underpayment led to the task enhancement effect that Weick had reported. Moreover, the researchers were also able to extend Weick's findings by obtaining enhanced task productivity in that condition. In contrast, no choice and underpayment participants felt dissatisfied and performed poorly. The reversal of those patterns occurred in the remaining conditions, No choice and overpayment participants worked hard as a function of their undeserved good fortune, whereas choice and overpayment participants found the task itself to be boring and perform it without energy or enthusiasm. The fourth criticism of equity theory is that some critics argue that equity theory is too abstract and difficult to apply in practice because it involves complex algebraic equations and relies on subjective perceptions. It can be challenging to apply in real world situations. This makes it less useful for managers and practitioners who need concrete tools and strategies for addressing workplace equity issues. Researchers have addressed this criticism by developing practical applications of equity theory in the workplace. For example, for managers tasked with setting salaries, using the outcome input ratio equation to ensure equity in pay might not be practical, as there are many variables that can affect how employees perceive their outcomes and inputs. An employee might feel that their work is more valuable than what their job title suggests, which can lead to feelings of underpayment even if the outcome input ratio appears equitable. Similarly, in case where two employees with different job titles are doing similar work, it can be challenging to determine the appropriate input and outcome measures to use in the equation, leading to difficulty in applying equity theory. Others have recommended using equity theory as a framework for designing performance appraisal systems or other human resource policies. By incorporating equity theory into practical applications, managers and practitioners can use the theory to create a more equitable workplace. After learning about equity theory, are you ready to apply the equity theory to your work in management, administration, and leadership? Here are some questions to help you explore new ways of thinking about equity in the workplace. First, can equity theory be used to promote collaboration and teamwork in organizations rather than competition and individual achievement? If so, what strategies might be effective? Second, how can equity theory be integrated with other management and leadership theories to create a more comprehensive approach to workplace equity and justice? Third, what are the potential ethical implications of using equity theory to determine compensation and rewards in organizations? How can this be addressed? Fourth, how can the integration of artificial intelligence and automation impact the application of equity theory in the workplace? How can organizations leverage these technologies to address equity concerns, and what new obstacles might emerge? Fifth, can equity theory be applied to non traditional work settings, such as remote or virtual teams? And if so, what adaptations might be necessary? Thanks for watching this video on equity theory. If you are interested in learning more about theories of management, administration, and leadership, be sure to tune in my future videos. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. If you want to know more about how to build a theoretical framework for your research, I have published a book titled Demystify Theories, a workbook for developing theoretical frameworks of educational leadership research. The link of the book is in the description below.